Assalamualaikum. I hope so you're all doing fine. I'm Dr. Muhammad Ali Rabbani, and we're going to continue with our series of lectures on spinal cord. Now we are going to discuss the descending tracts. So as the name indicates, these are the tracts that descend, that come down. They are the tracts that carry the signal from higher center down to the spinal cord, especially on the anterior horn and intermediate horn to be more clear, actually specific. And these are the tracks that are going to have influence on the outgoing signals. So these are the descending tracks. So we're going to learn about the descending tracks, and you should be able to outline the pathways of the voluntary movement, describe the location of first, second and third order neurons, and we are going to discuss the other tracks apart from the muscles, that track that is responsible for voluntary movement too. Okay, before jumping into the tracks, this is the terminology that I wanted to make clear. What is lower motor neuron and what is upper motor neuron? The lower motor neuron is the last neuron, the neuron of the alpha motor neuron of the gray column that is going to innervate the muscle. In this particular picture taken from neurosnell, so this is the last cell body that is going to produce an axon, and it's going to synapse with the neuromuscular junction to supply that muscle. In other words, you can see the final common pathway or the last neuron that is going to make the neuromuscular junction. Why I'm making so much influence focus on the last neuron? Because the signal, ultimately the signal started from the brain. As the brain signal comes down, the tract itself may have a number of nuclei or number of cells. So all of the axons, like this one coming from some local nucleus, this one coming from local neuron, those one coming from corticospinal tract, those one coming from the reticulospinal tract, those one coming from vestibulospinal tract, vestibular nucleus, olivary nucleus, corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, red nucleus, all of the tract that are coming from upwards. So these are the upper motor neurons. So all the neurons except this one, all of the neurons in the pathway except this one, the final neuron, these are upper motor neuron, and that this neuron, the alpha motor or gamma motor neuron, that is going to make a neuromuscular junction without anyone intervening, that is the lower motor neuron. Keep this information in mind, that will become very handy as we go on to discuss the tracts and their lesions, because we will be soon discussing the flaccid and spastic paralysis caused by lower motor and upper motor neurons lesions respectively. The basic organization, and this is especially true for the corticospinal tract. The corticospinal tract, the signal majorly starts from the first order neuron. The signal, because it is descending, we will move from above downwards. The first neuron, usually the first order, second order, third order, this terminology is not very commonly used for the descending tract. However, let's do that. The first order neuron, it starts from the cerebral cortex. This is the one that comes down. It does not relay in the mid. It comes all the way from corona radiata, internal capsule, different parts of the brain stem and spinal cord, and in the in the spinal cord or the lowermost part of the brainstem, it crosses the midline. You see here the first order neuron is crossing the midline. It comes down, and in down here it synapse with this second order neuron, this very small one. This is the second order neuron that starts and ends within the spinal cord. This is the second order neuron. It is also called intermediate or internuncial neuron, and then it goes on to supply the anterior lower motor neuron or anterior alpha motor neuron, anterior horn cell. So that anterior horn cell, alpha motor neuron, or this lower motor neuron, that is a third order neuron whose axon will go and travel all the way till it reaches the muscle and activates it by neuromuscular junction. So what different descending tracts are there and what are their functions? Corticospinal tract is the major one that you are going to be discussing, and this is the tract which directly comes from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex all the way to the alpha motor neurons of the spinal cord. And it is through this tract that voluntary, discrete and skill movements are done, especially true for the distal parts of the muscular limbs, that is the fingers and all that. I'm talking to you right now, I am moving my hands and moving the pencil, all of this is through the corticospinal tract. Reticulospinal tract. Reticulospinal tract is the one that is coming from reticular formation, that is a bundle of nerves and cells, bodies and axons in the brainstem especially, and it comes down and has its influence on the alpha and gamma motor neurons in spinal cord. It is further divided into the part that is coming from medulla oblongata, that is medullary part of reticulospinal tract, and the part that is coming from pontine nuclei, pontine reticulospinal tract. And the medullary one, it facilitates the flexor muscle tones, and the pontine one facilitates the extensor muscle tones. Tectospinal tract. This is the tract that is coming from superior colliculus. You must remember tectospinal tract from spinotectal tract. The tectospinal tract is the signal coming down from the tectum to the spinal cord. So any stimulus from the vision may lead to a response from the spinal cord. So reflex postural movement. I am sitting right here looking at the camera right now. Maybe I'll see a flash of light from my right side in my peripheral vision. I look like this. So this is a postural movement in response to vision. So reflex postural movement, these are through this tectospinal tract. And immediate also, even autonomic part, autonomic function is through this. For example, I enter a dark room, my eyes perceive darkness, and then I have to dilate my pupil. For that, sympathetic signal is needed, and that sympathetic signal will come from T1 level of the spinal cord. You remember the little horn? So the tectospinal tract will send the signal down to the spinal cord, and here from that T1 segment the signal will move out and till it reaches the eye. Rubrospinal tract, it is a tract that comes from the red nucleus of the midbrain, and it facilitates the flexor muscles and it inhibits the extensor muscles. Vestibulospinal tract. Vestibulospinal tract, it is coming from the lateral vestibular nucleus majorly, vestibular nuclei, and it facilitates the extensor muscles, that one that makes you straight and makes you stand up. So, and inhibits the flexor muscles. Olivospinally, it is not very much, there is not very much consensus about the presence of this nucleus, and it influences the muscular activity somehow. And then there is descending tracts and descending autonomic fibers that will influence the autonomic fibers for the sympathetic and parasympathetic system. Here I will share with you a very interesting mnemonic that I learned from Dr. Najib's lecture. VIPs make VIPs make you stand, you sit on a rubber mat. So what is the, how does it comes into my mind? So VIPs. V for vestibulospinal tract, P for pontine part of the reticulospinal tract. These tracts make you stand. They will make you stand, meaning, so these tracts, this pontine part, they will facilitate extensor. They will help straighten your back, straighten your legs, and will make you stand. And the those next two tracks, which are the next two tracks? You sit on a rubber mat. R for rubber, so rubrospinal tract. M for medullary part of reticulospinal tracts. These tracts make you sit. What when you do when you're sitting? Your back is flexed, your hip is flexed, your knee is flexed. So these tracts, these tracts, these help you sit. The rubrospinal tract facilitate flexors and the medullary part of reticulospinal tract facilitates flexors. So that's a mnemonic that will help you remember that. And one more thing that will make you very happy for that and will help you a lot: when you sit down, your legs are crossed like you sit on a carpet. So these tracks are crossed. When you stand up, your legs are straight and they are not crossing one another. So these tracks are uncrossed, and that will hold true for the corticospinal tract too. Corticospinal tract is the one that will ultimately lead to flexion. When you are doing any delicate work, you are flexing your hand, you are flexing your fingers, you are flexing your elbows. So corticospinal tract is also crossed. So this is a mnemonic that can help you remember the different functions of these tracts. Let us dive a little deeper into the corticospinal tract. As we will go in the direction of the signal, we will go from above downwards. Let's start from here. It starts from the name indicates cortex, corticospinal. It starts from the cortex. But from where exactly in the cortex? It's we can divide it into three parts. One third, one third, one third. Some book says 30%, 30%, and 40%. Whatever you like, both will work for you. Okay, one third, one third, one third. So one third is coming from the primary motor cortex, that is area 4, that is in the precentral gyrus. One third is in the secondary motor cortex, that is the premotor cortex and part of supplementary motor cortex. And the last third, interestingly enough, it is a descending tract. It is coming from the somatosensory cortex, the postcentral gyrus, the sensory one. What is the sensory cortex doing sending signal down? It is supposed to sit down quietly and receive the sensory signal. So what it is doing, it is sending the signal down, especially this part. It is sending the signal down that is going to modulate what signal is to come up or not. It is modulate the sensory input from to the CNS. Do you remember in the previous lecture of ascending tracts we saw that the pain signal coming up are modulated by down coming signal. So this is one of those methods. The cerebral cortex, as you will discuss in the histology, the cerebral cortex is made up of 6 layers. For now, for this purpose, you just need to remember that from the surface to below the fifth layer, the pyramidal cell layer, the pyramidal cells in this fifth layer are the ones whose axons make up this corticospinal tract. So we have started discussing the its origin point. It started from the cerebral cortex, one third from the primary, one third from the pre and supplementary, and one third from the sensory cortex. They are arising from the fifth layer, pyramidal cells in the fifth layer. It will move down. It will move down through. It will move down through the corona radiata, labeled here. This part. It will move down through internal capsule, this part, especially from the posterior limb. Then it will move through midbrain. So this is the basis pedunculi of midbrain, peduncles of midbrain, crus cerebri. It will move through this part of the middle two-thirds. It is labeled right here. Middle two-thirds of the midbrain. Then it will move through the base of pons. This part here they are separated by transverse going fibers, but I don't want to go into the detail of that right now. Then it will move down and it will move through the this area. This is called the pyramids of medulla oblongata. This raised area, and that pyramidal part that gives the name of the pyramidal track to this corticospinal tract. So it moves from there, and then in the lowermost part of the medulla oblongata, crossing occurs. 90% or more than 90%, some book says between 76 to 90% of the fibers, they cross the decussate at the lower part of medulla oblongata, at the junction of the medulla and spinal cord. Do you remember in the most starting point of the spinal cord we discussed that the demarcating point between the spinal cord and medulla oblongata is pyramidal decussation. So this is the pyramidal decussation, and as the fibers are crossing here, here, as the fibers are crossing, they are obliterating the anterior median fissure, and that is why it is visible externally. So what we're talking about is that the 90% of the fibers will be crossing here at that point, and after the crossing they will travel down in the spinal cord through lateral corticospinal tract. They will be traveling in the lateral corticospinal tract. From here, 90% will be crossing. So what about the other 10% who do not cross? The other 10% who do not cross are shown in the color black here, and these are the tracts that will move straight down without crossing in the spinal cord. In the anterior white column, these were anterior corticospinal tract. These were the anterior corticospinal tract. If you remember from this picture, we saw after crossing, the ones that have crossed, these are the lateral corticospinal tract, and the one that did not cross and came straight down, these are the anterior corticospinal tract. We're here. So we have entered the spinal cord. Okay, how do they terminate? Let's talk about the lateral corticospinal tract. The lateral corticospinal tract, this usually terminate, this picture is a little clearer here. The lateral corticospinal tract, sometimes in most of the cases, they synapse with a intermediary neuron, the internuncial neuron, and that internuncial neuron that influences the gamma motor or alpha motor neuron. However, the there are other options too. Sometimes for the muscles where we are mostly doing discrete movements, for example, very fine movements of our fingers. So in such cases, in very those limited cases, the alpha motor, these corticospinal tract coming down, they may synapse directly with the alpha motor neuron without any intervening internuncial neuron. And third case, do you remember that we had signals coming down from the sensory areas? So those will synapse in the dorsal horn. Those will synapse in the dorsal horn, and they will modulate the signals going up. So that is how the lateral corticospinal tract terminates by either majority of the cases internuncial neurons, some cases in the highly localized function anterior motor neurons, and sometimes the dorsal horn in the dorsal horn for the modulation of upgoing signals. And the what about the anterior corticospinal tract that was going down? Keep in mind that the signal starting from one side of the hemisphere will ultimately has to end on the other side of the muscles. So it did not cross in the medulla oblongata, but it realizes it's now, and it crosses now in the spinal cord at the point where it has to exit. So it crosses the midline in the commissure and synapse with the internuncial or alpha motor neurons on that side. So it ultimately crossed the midline. It did not go without crossing itself. And this Lateral corticospinal tract, it is the one that is majorly important for distal muscles, and it is important for discrete movements, and this is the one that is major responsible for axial muscles, especially for fixation of the proximal part of the limb, as the distal one is going to do its function. And there may be other branches too. For example, the signal going down, they may return to the cerebral cortex to give the feedback. They may go back to the subcortical area, to the brainstem, to the thalamus, to the subthalamus, to the cerebellum, and this signal will inform the lower sides what the brain is sending the signal down to. So that is about the corticospinal tract. I hope so it made sense. We talked about its origin. It started from the cortex, from the three regions. The first 30% from the first the 30% from the primary motor cortex, 30% from the pre and supplementary motor cortex, and 40% from the somatosensory area. It traveled down from the corona radiata, internal capsule, crus cerebri, basis of pons, pyramid of medulla, and in the lowermost part of medulla at the junction of medulla and spinal cord, it crossed the midline in 90% of the cases. After crossing, the track was called lateral corticospinal tract. It moved down in the lateral column and it ended by majorly synapsing with the internuncial neurons or directly with the alpha motor neurons or the dorsal horn. And the alpha motor neuron will ultimately go and activate the muscle it is supplying. For those tracts, 10% who did not cross the anterior corticospinal tract, it will move down in the same side all the way down, and they will cross the midline at the point where they have to exert their influence. So that is the anterior corticospinal tract, and the anterior corticospinal tract was responsible for axial muscles and their fixation, and the dorsal column was responsible for for distal musculature for discrete, voluntary, controlled activity. And on the way going down, collaterals were given in the cerebral cortex, in the subcortical areas, in the red nucleus, in the reticular formation, and in the other parts, in the other areas below the brain that will keep them informed of what is going on. So that is about corticospinal tract. And we will be using this picture for Snell's neuroanatomy about for the descending tracts, reticulospinal tracts. These are the tracks that are going from reticular formation downwards. Reticular formation here is shown here in this a series of green colored axons. So this is a interconnected meshwork of axons from all the way down going to brainstem, reticular tract. The tract runs all the way through medulla oblongata and pons and midbrain. The two tracts, pontine part of reticulospinal tract, as the name indicates, here, it starts from the pontine part of reticulospinal tract, reticular formation. Do you remember? VIPs make you stand. So it will be the extensor bias. It will make you stand, and it will be majorly uncrossed. It will be majorly uncrossed as you don't cross your legs while standing. Medullary reticulospinal tract, it will be extending from the medullary part of reticular formation, and it will be majorly crossed, and it will move down in the lateral column, and it will be responsible for, you sit on a rubber mat, the fixation bias, facilitating fixation, flexion muscles and inhibiting the extending muscles. And keep in mind the word mostly, because in this picture both of the tracks crossed and uncrossed are found. For medullary track, crossed and uncrossed are found. So these tracks have both crossed and uncrossed components, but with the majority we are talking about being crossed or uncrossed. Influences voluntary activity. Okay, let us now talk about the vestibulospinal tract. As the name indicates, is the tract that will move signal from the take signal from the vestibular nucleus all the way down to the spinal cord. Okay, the origin, as we saw, the origin is from the vestibular nucleus. Vestibular nuclear complex is a series of nuclei. There is a medial one, lateral one, superior one, inferior one. Among them, the nucleus that is majorly giving input for the vestibulospinal tract is the lateral vestibular nucleus, and especially there are a large size cells, a giant cell of Bases that are getting giving these axons that are making this track. The vestibular nucleus itself, it's receiving an input signal from the cerebellum and deep nuclei of the cerebellum and directly from the ear to vestibular nuclei of the ear. So VIPs made you stand. This tract is responsible for facilitating the extensor muscles and inhibiting the flexor muscle. So this is, you don't cross your legs while standing. This is mostly uncrossed tract, and it moves down and ultimately it terminates on the internuncial neurons and the anterior gray column. Apart from the corticospinal tract, part of the corticospinal tract ending on alpha motor neurons for the voluntary movements. Again, for a fixed part, most of the tracts they end in the internuncial neuron. And the function is to facilitate the extensor muscles and inhibit the flexor muscles. So this is called extensor bias. So it is responsible for keeping you upright, keeping you straight while standing. Rubrospinal tract. Name indicates the rubrospinal tract. Rubrum. This indicates start from red nucleus. Red nucleus, rubrospinal tract. It itself is influenced by cerebellum, deep nuclei of the cerebellum, and by the cerebral cortex. It is influenced by cerebellum and cerebellar cortex. Now, rubrospinal tract, from here, it crosses the midline. You sit on a rubber mat. This is the tract that is going to influence the flexor muscles. So you sit while crossing the legs. It just crosses the midline as seen here in the midbrain as it exits the red nucleus, and it travels down majorly in the right left column, lateral column, along with the corticospinal tract. Let me show you. It travels here. It travels with the corticospinal tract, rubrospinal tract, and it moves down and ultimately it reaches the until it reaches the spinal cord at the point where it has to influence magic influence. So it synapses with the internuncial neuron, and through the internuncial neuron, it has influence on the lower motor neuron. Its function through the signals that it receives from the cerebral cortex and cerebellum. According to that, it indirectly exerts its influences on the spinal cord motor nuclei, resulting in the facilitation of the flexor and inhibitors of the extensors flexor biased muscles. Reticulospinal tract, tectospinal tract. Tectospinal tract, it starts from the superior colliculus. This is a nuclei that is present in the in the midbrain portion of the brainstem, and it is responsible for different visual reflexes. And that is a tract that is majorly crossing, and it descends close down the midline near the medial longitudinal fasciculus. What is that? We will see that further in the brainstem and further lectures. And this is majorly responsible for coordination of eye movements in response to the balance and other such things. Okay, and it moves down tectospinal tract. It moves anterior near the anterior median fissure. It comes down and it terminates again in where? In the alpha, in the internuncial neurons, and through the internuncial neurons, it is going to have its influence on the alpha motor neurons. This is responsible for the reflex postural movements in response to visual stimuli. You saw a light flash on your side, you immediately turned your neck towards that side. In response to the visual stimulus, your spinal cord made a reflex. This is tectospinal, and that will include the reflex. That will the dilatation of the pupil in response to the light. So the signal coming from darkness will come here. It will move all the way down till it reaches the thoracic segment T1, T2 segments, where through the preganglionic sympathetic fibers in the lateral horn, the signal will move out, ultimately reaching the eye through the ciliary ganglion. Olivospinal tract, it is coming down from the olivary nucleus after crossing down, and it has a number of influences from the red nucleus, from the basal nuclei to the cerebral cortex, and from other pathways too. And it has an influence through inferior olivary nucleus. These areas maintain their influence on the muscles. Again, this is not very clearly defined track, and many still doubt its existence. Function is the cerebellum like functions. Descending autonomic fibers, they are originating from different parts of the brain, the cerebral cortex. Some are coming from hypothalamus. Keep that in mind. A lot of them are coming from hypothalamus, as when we discuss, when we will study the hypothalamus, so we'll see that there are different areas that are dedicated in giving signals for the sympathetic system. There are areas dedicated from parasympathetic system. Then there is amygdaloid nuclear complex, a part of limbic system, reticular formation. So all these fibers, they come down as a tract. They don't make a very distinct standalone track as was made by others. So we use a general term of descending autonomic fibers. They usually cross the midline. Most of them are in the lateral white column, but variation and changes may be there, and they ultimately terminate in great lateral gray column. Do you remember what was in lateral gray horns? In lateral gray columns, there was presynaptic sympathetic from T1 to L2, presynaptic parasympathetic from S2 to S3. So ultimately, these tracks are going to influence that point. Please disregard this information as it may get confusing. It is usually, a lot of the times, it is ipsilateral. Any crossing that occurs above the spinal cord. So when we are discussing Brown Sequard syndrome and damages in the spinal cord, we will be discussing that these do not cross the midline in the spinal cord. Any crossing that occurs beforehand. So this is a table from Snell's neuroanatomy, and it gives a summary of all the tracks that we have discussed so far. So that brings me to the end of the descending tracks. If you have any questions, any suggestions, or any feedback on the lecture, please let me know in the comments. I will be very happy to answer to them. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for the next lecture on intersegmental tracts or spinal reflexes. Thank you so much.